I have seen more movies in 2015 than I have in any other year, well over 100. And having seen that much, I think I can safely say this has not only been a really good year for cinema, but an incredibly diverse one too. This wasn't a year ruled either by the blockbusters or the prestige pictures. It's been a great mix of both, with even some overlap between the two ends of the spectrum. There have been so many great films from this year that I couldn't fit them all on this list, but know that I certainly liked more films I saw than disliked. So, without further preamble, let's start the list. Denis Villeneuve is a master when it comes to dark, depressing storytelling, and they don't get much more pessimistic than Sicario. A film about the Mexican drug cartel is never going to be a particularly uplifting story, but this is a film that goes to some really rough places and shows that neither side is really fighting towards an end. It's just a shaky power balance steadied by a never-ending stream of violence. Emily Blunt, Josh Brolin, and Benicio del Toro are all on absolute top form as FBI agents working at various levels of corruption, with del Toro's intimidating Alejandro especially captivating in every scene with a distinct mix of menace and sympathy. It's also one of the most beautifully grungy films ever shot, with Roger Deakins' haunting cinematography capturing the tension of every action beat all on its own. Not exactly a fun time at the movies, but certainly an experience you won't regret. Charles Schultz's classic Peanuts comic strips have stuck in the popular conscience for good reason. They're simple but timeless stories that kids of any generation can relate to. In cynical hands, the movie version would have just been an excuse to slap a recognizable name on a tired and hackneyed premise, but thankfully the people behind the Peanuts movie actually cared to make something good. It sticks to the basic tenets of a typical Charlie Brown story, but does so in such a charming and uplifting way. It has its modern elements for sure, but nothing that severely dates it, ensuring that kids decades from now can still watch and understand it perfectly. Delightfully simple and wonderfully retro in its animation style, it's ultimately a film about dealing with childhood insecurity, and whether you're still a kid or have fond memories of being one, there's bound to be an element of this movie you can relate to. Mission Impossible Rogue Nation doesn't feel like the fifth entry in a 20-year-old franchise, simply because it doesn't display any of the complacency most series suffer from by this point. It's not a profound or particularly original film, but that doesn't mean it isn't clever, funny, spectacular, or any other such adjectives. There's just an engaging sense of momentum to the whole experience, delivering pulse-pounding action with just the right amount of breaks for intrigue and character development to make the film a little more than just a series of ridiculous set pieces. Sometimes it's okay for a film to just be simple, fun entertainment, as long as it does so with exceptional skill and effort. Tom Cruise continues to prove, perhaps a little overzealously, that he's still capable of pulling off these amazing stunts, and as long as he's still game, I have no problem with him throwing himself into these situations for any number of sequels. Deconstructions of the romantic comedy aren't exactly new, but Trainwreck is one of the best examples I've ever seen of one. It manages to modernize and ground and subvert what is otherwise a fairly standard love story by constantly asking one simple question: what would be the smart thing to do here? Instead of having our characters get caught up on mistakes or misunderstandings or differences, let's have them talk about it like, real people would. But it also doesn't forget why exactly people keep coming back to these types of movies, and manages to create something that is equal parts charming, emotional, clever, and intoxicatingly funny. Amy Schumer's voice as an actor and writer exudes from every scene in this film, and I'd love to hear more from her. And this is also easily Judd Apatow's best directorial work since The 40-Year-Old Virgin, possibly even his best to date. Cop Car isn't a film a lot of you will have seen, especially since it didn't even get a theatrical release in the UK, but its premise alone should have you intrigued. Two young boys find an abandoned police cruiser and decide to take it for a joyride, soon finding themselves chased across the highways by the officer they stole it from, whose motives are far more sinister than just wanting his car back. John Watts certainly owes a lot to the Coen brothers with this sophomore directorial effort, and with it he's created a simple but entertaining and humorous tale about what happens when youthful innocence meets the dark side of reality, featuring some excellent performances from its lead child stars and an especially dark turn by Kevin Bacon. It's not exactly the kind of film that screams, "This director must make the next Spider-Man movie," but it certainly screams talent, and I'm glad he's getting that chance to do something bigger. Philippe Petit is a fascinating figure, and his story was so effectively told in the documentary Man on Wire that I couldn't understand for the longest time why Robert Zemeckis felt the need to make his own version. But The Walk justifies its existence by being its own unique film and telling the story from a different viewpoint. It presents Petit's efforts to walk between the towers of the World Trade Center less like a straight biopic and more like a fairy tale. When viewed from that angle, Joseph Gordon-Levitt narrating the story directly to camera while standing atop the Statue of Liberty suddenly makes sense. Petit was and still is a man fascinated with the magic of his craft, and this is a movie that embraces that same kind of wonder in every facet of its production. The final scenes depicting the walk itself are breathtaking to behold, especially in IMAX 3D, and the way it subtly acknowledges the untimely fate of the towers is simple and moving. Quentin Tarantino may be treading on similar ground with The Hateful Eight as he did on Django Unchained, but he does so with shoes that leave a distinctly different print. Whereas that film was about an honest, strong man seeking justice for the atrocities laid against him, none of the titular Hateful Eight are wholly good people. Some have blacker hearts than others, but they're all grey. Even the sheriff holds a racial prejudice and nearly sells out his only comrade. It occupies that same morally blank area many of the great westerns do, where even our supposed heroes can say and do horrible things, but it still has that honor amongst thieves mentality that keeps these characters from being despicable. Tarantino has always been great at verbal sparring contests, and seeing this great cast banter back and forth with his signature dialogue is engrossing to watch. Tarantino has said he's going to stop after 2 more movies, and with this I can safely assume he's said everything he needs to say about the western. As a film, Spotlight is extremely minimalistic. It doesn't have fancy cinematography, or a rousing score, or grand production design. It's just a bunch of people sitting in a drab office, talking. It's about as simple and clinical as, well, a newspaper article. But Spotlight doesn't need fancy presentation to be impactful, because what it is saying is far more important than how it says it. By subduing itself in the way it does, it makes the shocking truths it reveals hit home harder. Like how this team of reporters kept looking into this case because they needed the whole story for it to work, Spotlight as a film keeps going deeper and deeper into a story that's already shocking from the start, and in doing so creates a troubling but honest portrait of how uncontrolled power can corrupt an organization's methods and ideals. It's a prime example of how you don't always need a unique voice to make a good film. You just need a good story, and the right way of telling it. In any other hands, Room could have been a thoroughly depressing experience. While it's not based on any particular real-life story, it's a tragedy we so often see on the news and could have easily just been 2 hours of moping. But Lenny Abramson has instead taken a story filled with despair and somehow made it hopeful and inspiring, and all by simply telling the story from the point of view of a child. Jack is completely unaware of how horrible his life is, and though we see that as an atrocity, to him it's the norm. Though he has trouble adapting once freed from that captivity, it's his mother that struggles the most, and he knows that. He can't understand why, but he knows that now she's the one that needs his help. It's a wonderful tale about seeing the tiniest light in the pits of darkness, and the combined efforts of Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay helps rank them amongst the best mother-son relationships ever seen on film. I don't think The Lobster could be more surreal without turning into a Terry Gilliam cartoon. And even then I'm not sure I'd be able to tell the difference. A satire of the way we view modern relationships, it's a film that revels in its own absurdity and makes no attempt to be subtle or even resemble reality. This is a film where Colin Farrell's brother is a dog, Ben Whishaw tries to attract a woman by pretending he has constant nosebleeds, and Léa Seydoux leads a pack of rebellious single people who like to hold silent discos in the middle of the forest. The dialogue is so obtuse and the performances are so stilted that you could be convinced it's plain incompetent, but every moment is sincere in its insanity, and buried within the madness is a profound statement about how falling in love isn't something that can be forced or ignored. It just sort of happens. Aaron Sorkin certainly had an easier starting place with Steve Jobs than he did with The Social Network. To be frank, Jobs was a far more interesting person than Mark Zuckerberg ever will be, whether played by Lex Luthor or not. And while Steve Jobs isn't as polished or timely as the aforementioned Fincher film, it does provide an interesting view into the world of the controversial entrepreneur and explores a unique presentational style for a biopic. The movie is essentially just 3 long scenes, structured far more like a play than a movie, but through it we gain a far more interesting insight into the mind of this man than a simple linear account of Jobs' life ever could. Like he did with Facebook, Sorkin takes a story filled with technical jargon about RAM memory and sales targets and makes it riveting, and topped with Danny Boyle's direction and the stellar cast, it makes itself as vital a watching experience as its spiritual predecessor. Ex Machina was the first film of 2015 I saw, and over a year later, it's still one of my favourites. Good hard science fiction is hard to come by these days, and with this film Alex Garland nails everything that goes into one. An interesting and thought-provoking premise, simple but nuanced characters played by wonderful actors, and a stark but beautiful visual style. But unlike so many other serious science fiction movies, it doesn't forget to show some humanity, and is as witty as it is provocative. Alicia Vikander's year was overall spectacular with one notable exception, but this is the performance she'll be remembered for, not just this year, but perhaps her entire career. She's simply the most fascinating and sympathetic robot character I've seen in over a decade. From a simple description, Creed sounds like a fake movie featured in a cutaway gag on Family Guy, but in execution, it's actually the best Rocky film since the original. Some may dismiss the film upon a glance as unnecessary, saying Rocky Balboa wrapped up the story perfectly and didn't need to be followed up on. But whilst Creed does tell a story after the end of that 6th chapter, it isn't a continuation of that narrative. Rather, it is the beginning of a new legacy, one that reflects upon the past and uses it to inform the future. Like Adonis himself, Creed is a movie trying to live up to its predecessor's legacy without looking like a copy, even shunning the Rocky name. But it knows what the original did right, and utilizes its strength to improve itself, whilst also continuing to be its own individual movie. This is a film that so perfectly captures the desperation of its situation and environment that it almost feels like a dramatization of a real-life disaster yet to happen. Ridley Scott hasn't been this good in well over a decade, and I'm frankly overjoyed he hasn't forgotten how to make movies like so many of us have thought for the past few years. The Martian combines interesting speculative science with raw human heart to make something genuinely emotional. It's not the overwrought, almost clinical approach to having a human center Interstellar took. It simply places a character in a dire situation and shows us how he deals with it. It finds the humor and the wonder in this predicament and uses that to present a hopeful future where nations can unite and share their resources, all for the purpose of saving one man from being stuck on a red planet listening to a constant loop of ABBA songs. Star Wars The Force Awakens is not a perfect movie. It follows a very simple and predictable formula, its frantic pacing means important details are only explained in supplementary material, and most of its ideas are simply reinterpretations on already established concepts in the franchise. But not all films are to be judged on if they do something new. More often than not, it's just about doing something simple really, really well. And The Force Awakens does simple but engaging storytelling better than most films this decade. A lot of its enjoyment relies on nostalgia, sure, but it's a compelling story whether you're a lifelong fanatic or someone new to the franchise. Years from now, there will be thousands of Star Wars fans whose introduction to the galaxy far, far away was The Force Awakens, a playful, rousing, emotional, dazzling, totally awesome film. As someone introduced to it primarily through The Phantom Menace, I'm kind of jealous. I love me and Earl and the Dying Girl as much as I do, mainly because it's a movie that so resembles me as a person. But there's a lot in this picture that should resonate with anyone. Most films about making films are either about the frustrations of production, or just a bunch of pop culture references. This is one that's all about the emotional drive to make this one movie, how it both tears apart and brings together these disparate kids, and how through it they become different people. Maybe not better people, but different people. It's a strange mix of concepts, both nailing the way young people speak and behave and think in this era, but also finding time to go off on random tangents about the films of Werner Herzog. It's kind of like The Fault in Our Stars mixed with Be Kind Rewind, as written and directed by John Hughes, but I'd say it's better than both of those aforementioned films and most of Hughes' entire filmography. Those aren't statements I make lightly. That's how much I love this film. I made the hyperbolic statements in my initial review that if Kingsman: The Secret Service didn't make my top 10 by the end of 2015, this will have been one of the best years in cinema ever. It's managed to stay comfortably at number 4. Yes, Kingsman is immature, over the top, and unconcerned with things like taste or reality, but that's the whole point of it. This is a film that knows exactly what it is and achieves its goals with exemplary form, but with every moment of brutal action and crude humor also comes intelligence and wit. Matthew Vaughn takes all of the explosive rock and roll energy he infused into Kick-Ass and perfects the formula with biting deconstruction of the spy genre, a stronger sense of depth with its themes of class warfare, and one of the best fucking action sequences in recent memory. Seriously, I will never be able to listen to Freebird the same way again. Making a movie filled with complicated financial jargon can easily make for a boring watch, but Adam McKay not only takes the time to explain everything, he does so in humorous and ingenious ways that make for both an entertaining film and an educational one too. The Big Short balances that fine line between comedy and drama perfectly, filling its story of greed and stupidity with plenty of witty dialogue, but never forgets to remind you of the drastic stakes involved. It's a film not afraid to depict its main characters in darker lights, ultimately showing how even as these people fought the financial crisis, they were losing a part of themselves in the process. Nobody really wins in this situation. If you perhaps thought The Wolf of Wall Street was a little too perverse, The Big Short delivers a similar but more poignant experience that doesn't wallow in its own excess. It seems almost trite to say, but the most emotional film of the year for me was a movie literally about emotions. Pixar isn't invincible, Cars 2 and The Good Dinosaur have proved that, but like Joy learns through her adventure in Inside Out, imperfection is what makes us human. I've heard some people complain this movie is too complex for kids, but I can't think of that as anything but a good thing. Children need films that challenge them as well as entertain them. Inside Out explains concepts like maturation and depression to kids better than most adults can, and does so in a witty, imaginative, and entertaining way to boot. If that's not an amazing feat of artistic expression, then clearly I know nothing. There have been some great movies in 2015, but for me there's no denying there was only one true king. As much as people go on about how The Force Awakens has brought Star Wars back from the dead, nobody was thinking about Mad Max before Fury Road came along, and now the franchise is more popular than ever. It's the purest example of how a film can be both ridiculously entertaining, whilst also being thought-provoking, masterfully constructed, and utterly beautiful in all the right ways. Does it have much more of a plot than drive fast and blow up stuff? No, but Fury Road clearly isn't a film about story. It's about character, and environment, and theme, and composition, and spectacle, and emotion, and just generally being fucking awesome. It's a movie that represents everything that is wonderful and unique about cinema in 2 hours of pure, adrenaline-fueled art. And that is why it is my favorite film of 2015.